It might be the dog days of summer, but the debate over electoral reform continues. MPs on the Electoral Reform Committee continue to meet in Ottawa, hear from witnesses, and discuss how to change our first-past-the-post system into something that they consider more democratic. Now, the argument from those that want a new system for Canada is that, well, the current one is old because Twitter, because 21st century. They haven't made solid arguments for why we need to change it. The arguments from those of us that say no, why change it? Primarily, why alter a system that's produced one of the most stable, healthy, ongoing democracies in the world? Well, there's a new argument out against changing our system towards something that resembles proportional representation, and regardless of which format comes forward, there will likely be some form of proportional rep in that. A new study from the Fraser Institute says proportional representation governments cost more. They take more of your money, they spend more of your money. Taylor Jackson is a policy analyst with the Fraser Institute. He joins me now, and you're one of the authors of the study. Taylor, were you surprised by the findings? Did you go into this thinking, let's just take a look, or did you have a hunch?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Brian. We certainly went in there thinking, let's take a look what the data says. Let's take a look at the policy consequences of changing our electoral system. This is something that doesn't typically come up in the debate. And when we looked at the data and when we reviewed a number of studies that have also looked at how electoral systems specifically affect fiscal policy, the findings are quite clear that a move to proportional representation would likely lead to larger government spending and bigger deficits in Canada.
Let's bring up one of the infographics that you've got in your report, and it just says that when you have the type of system we currently have, a plurality majoritarian system, 15% of governments result in coalitions, and on average the central government takes about 23% of GDP, but in proportional representation systems, it's 83%. They take 29% of GDP. 6% may not sound like a lot, but if I took a 6% pay cut, I'd feel it.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is quite a large difference. And what happens in proportional representation is you end up electing more parties to the legislature. And typically, it takes a coalition government to form a majority and able to enact legislation. So as you mentioned, 83% of elections in proportional representation countries end up with these coalition governments. And, these larger parties, they need the support of the smaller parties. They have to give in somewhere on the agenda of smaller parties. And this is really what leads to the higher spending. And it is quite a large number. I mean, we're talking 29% of GDP spending in proportional representation, 23% about there in majoritarian plurality systems like Canada. And it's not just spending, it's also larger deficits.
Taylor, I've covered the change of power of many governments at the federal and provincial level, and even when conservative governments come into power, typically spending goes up immediately because everyone gets into power and they may not be able to cut programs very quickly. That may take some time, but they want to enact their promises, their spending promises to their coalition, their voting coalition partners, as quickly as possible. So even under Stephen Harper in the early days, spending went up right away, and as a percentage of GDP came down over time. I can only imagine what it will be like, even for conservative parties, if you've got to, horse trade behind the scenes, what it's going to be like. You've got to, get Bob's party behind you and, bald-headed white guy party behind you and everything else, and they've all got their spending asks in exchange for their support.
Yeah, no, certainly. I mean, this really is the finding of the broader literature and the broader work that's been done on this topic. It is this, the bargaining that has to go on with the smaller parties, the giving into their interests. And certainly it is quite a wide-ranging finding in terms of the number of studies that have come to this conclusion that we would likely be headed towards higher spending.
Is this a solid argument, do you think? There's some fiscal conservatives, people who are concerned about fiscal issues, like people that would normally support the Fraser Institute. Do you think this is a solid argument to them to say, you know what, rethink your support of going towards proportional rep?
Yeah, we really think that this is a key part of the debate, and it's a part of the debate that Canadians just don't hear. You don't typically hear politicians or those in favor of changing the electoral system talking about the policy consequences of changing our electoral system. And there would be consequences. We think there would certainly be higher spending, larger deficits, and this all comes at a time when governments across Canada are engaged in more spending, racking up the deficit. So I think Canadians need to be clear about there could be policy consequences to a change.
Taylor, final question to you. Did you look at or account for the extra elections? We know elections cost a lot of money, and one of the knocks against proportional rep is that some of the countries that use it have had far more elections than we've had over, say, 40, 50 years.
No, that was really beyond the scope of what we looked at. What we really just looked at is spending by the government in general, not specific spending or extra spending that would come from more elections. But again, when we look at this in general, it is quite a bit larger in proportional representation countries than it is in majoritarian or plurality countries like Canada.
Taylor Jackson is a senior policy analyst at the Fraser Institute. You can find out more at FraserInstitute.org. Thanks for the time, Taylor.
No, thank you for having me, Brian.
Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.